And this is not a comprehensive list. This is just a couple of things. Like any medium, it's about playing with your materials. So if I take some wet paint, let's say, and I'm just going to paint a little square here, and let's say I'm creating a scene onto which, for example, I'd paint a flower. Okay, now the paper, if it's glossy, then it's still wet. If the paper is not glossy, then it's not wet anymore. If it's really super wet, I can't do this effect. I'd have to wait a little bit until it's a little drier. But if the paper's just a little glossy, what I can do is I can clean off the bulk of the color, get my brush a little damp, and just give it a little flick. And notice now where I flick and those water droplets hit the damp green. See the kind of starburst effects it's making? Now they're a little clunkier than a watercolor starburst effect would be. But still, that can sometimes be interesting in the background of a painting. Conversely, I could also take some color, maybe I'll mix like a really dark greeny color, and I could flick the paint onto it too. So it doesn't have to just be water, I could actually flick some paint onto it. And because it's still wet, that paint might fuzz out a little bit. If this is a background, let's say, of a flower, that could be interesting. Mm-hmm. It gives it some different effects. I'd let that dry and then paint on top of it. Something else you could do if you have an area that has, let's say, like, I'm still just going to stick with that foliage idea. I could paint an area, have it be damp, and then let's say there are a lot of other things going on in that background. Maybe there's some other leaves and stems. So while that's still damp, I can go in and create the impression of other stems and leaves. And because it's still wet, we get soft edges, what we call soft edges, where it looks a little blurry around the outline. It starts to spread a little bit. It's not a crisp, solid line. And I can go in while it's still damp, maybe with some colors that are a little bit complementary to the greens. So not just green, but maybe some kind of an orangey reddish colors as well. Maybe pure red in places, just to add some more interest to it. And again, maybe some dots and dabs of some of those reds. If I have red flowers that I'm painting on top of this later, any of those dots and dabs, they start to blur a little bit. You can already see it starting to happen in that background. It makes them feel like they go off into the distance. And I can't control it. You know, it's going to do what it's going to do. Look at the red. It's starting to bleed a little bit. It doesn't do what watercolor would do, where it would really, you know, spread a little bit more and mix with the green. You notice instead it pushes the green away. And around the edges of that red, it becomes a little lighter. So not like watercolor. It's its own thing, but that can be interesting as well. And abstracting that background can make for a really nice pattern in behind a picture. And then over top of it, I can get thicker with the paint. As I mentioned before, our first layers of paint, let's just go through this again. First layer of paint is a little bit more runny, maybe even downright watery. Okay. But as I start building my layers, I can't be as watery anymore. Because what happens is, and this isn't dry, but if I have a drier brush and I go over, it just starts to lift up what's there. If I get a really wet brush and I pull, I can actually lift out areas. Maybe that's actually something you want to do. Maybe you want to do that. Maybe in an abstracted background, you want, you know, knowing that's something you don't normally want to do when you're painting, but you have it happen to you and it drives you crazy. You go, I can use that. This could be maybe a window pane that you put some, you know, reflection or highlights in by just wiping out. That'd be more of a watercolor technique as well. So these are techniques here that use the paint more like a watercolor, even though it doesn't act fully like a watercolor would act. It gives you some of those same effects. This blurry edge by painting wet into wet, being able to lift out paint while it's still damp. You can even lift it out when it dries a bit as well. So see, that's dry, but by going over it with a wet brush, I can lift that paint right out. Now that can be a pro and a con, because if I'm trying to layer something on top and I keep petting the painting, instead of just adding more paint, I'm pulling paint from underneath. So this is almost dry. This was really watery to start. If I want to add another layer of green to this green, I've got to add less water to the paint. And I really push and wiggle it into the bristles. If I want to add another layer on top of that of white to cover, here's what happens if I go over all of that with a watery white. It kind of bleeds in, and look at how see-through that green is. You can still see it, but also the white just kind of bleeds into that background a little bit. That could be an interesting effect, but know how it's going to act. Instead, if I want a more opaque white, look at, instead of pushing and wiggling my paint into the white, I have to kind of scoop it up and put it down.
Oh.
So it has texture, it's thicker, and I just am holding it a little bit more parallel to the paper rather than doing this. So that rather than dragging some of that paint, even with it thick on there, as I'm dragging, notice how it's whiter here, but as I continue dragging, I'm grabbing more green. And the only way to stay truly white on top of that darker area is to use thicker, goopier paint. So it really is about changing the viscosity of the paint as you go along. So you start off with runnier paint, and then you get a little thicker, so less water. And at the end, if you want a really nice thick highlight, you might have to lay it down really thick, you know, nice and goopy, where it actually, when you look at it from the side, it has texture. You can see the thickness of it. I still have the flexibility of being able to soften that edge after the fact. But you can't do too much of it, because then I start wiping out.
Yeah.
Also so I can only do a little bit of it. Also, the other thing about gouache, see this wipeout that I did? Look at that edge there. See how dark it is? All I did was displace the pigment that I wiped out here to the side.
So it just pushed down into the...
Pushed it over. It didn't all pick up on the brush. It pushed it over, and that's happening a little bit even here. So even when I'm trying to soften, you know, it's still going to just displace it. So I might have to go back over it. You'll never get it perfect. So don't obsess about making it perfect. Just squint your eyes, and does it look soft enough? Then leave it. Because the more you mess around with it, the more you're going to start carving in. Figure out what you want to do. If I want to paint a flower on top of this and I want that background to be kind of abstracted, I'm going to throw a bunch of stuff in there, make it abstracted, and then leave it. Let it dry. Because the more I mess with this, the more I'm going to affect the paper. Then when I want to put in the flower, let's say I want to put in a pink flower. Well, in the shadow, that pink is usually purple. So maybe I'll start with, and I don't have a picture in front of me, so this is going to be an awful flower. I apologize. It's just going to be some purples. I can't put 20 strokes in here for those purples. I'm just going to put a few. I'm going to clean off my brush and start getting a little bit lighter. I'm going to use just, and notice I'm cleaning off my brush, tapping it firmly on the bottom, wiping it off on my paper towel. It's still damp. Push and wiggle that red in there now for maybe some more vibrant color. And I might have to go in again after 3 or 4 strokes. This is still for my pink flower, but I'm starting with my darks. Clean off my brush. Now I'm going to get pink. So I'm going to mix my red and my white. No water, so I'm not going to use that white that I had pre-mixed. Now I've got to be really more economic in my strokes. Because the more brush work I do, the more I'm going to lift up the green underneath and make my red muddy, because red and green are complementary colors and they'll make it neutral. But also, the less vibrant the pink will be naturally, because it'll be more translucent. So I've got to use more paint. If I want to highlight, I go in there. Now maybe it's even thicker. Maybe it's even thick and goopy white for some highlights here and there in places on top. So I can cover up some of the background. I just have to get thicker with the paint, less water, and I have to be really conscious of how many strokes I'm putting in there. A dry brush stroke is just loading your brush with paint with no water on the brush and just skipping it across the top of the surface, letting those little cracks show through. That can be interesting on its own as well. And especially at the end of a brush stroke where I flick it up off the paper like a plane taking off the runway, it gives the impression of the line fading out, almost becoming blurry in a way visually. When you look at it up close, you see the messiness of the stroke, but from a distance, it visually feels like it's going off into the distance and getting smaller and blurrier, even though it's not. It's just a dry brush stroke.